recording. Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started. If you, just as a reminder, I think because of the bandwidth, we're going to ask folks, unless you're speaking, to mute yourself and to take off your video. That helps with making sure we have enough bandwidth for everyone. Ms. Kennedy, are you on? I just want to make sure that you're on as well.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Great, great. Okay, so it's 11:01. So I would like to call to order this meeting of the Assembly's Committee, Public Safety Committee. It is 11:01 on Wednesday, August 12th. And we'll start by doing roll call. Mandy, if you can go around and do roll call for the Assembly members, please.
Yes. Ms. Kennedy?
Here.
Mr. Perez-Verdia?
Here.
Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Mr. Constant? Mr. Dunbar?
Here.
Ms. Zaletel?
Here.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Here.
Mr. Rivera? Mr. Weddleton? Ms. Allard? Ms. LaFrance? Thank you.
Thank you, Mandy. So just a quick review. Our agenda today really has actually four main items. It's likely the majority of the time, or a large portion of the time, is going to be taken up by our first item, which is a discussion regarding the use of force policy, AO 2020-80. And then we'll also have a discussion regarding audit and maintenance issues in the Anchorage Fire Department. I'll review sort of the beginnings of a running list of priority and items that the committee is going to be working on in our running list of to-dos and items, and then we'll have an opportunity to recap some of the discussion that was taking place at the alcohol tax town halls that we had, and any thoughts and recommendations about moving forward with that. So with that, let's get started. Ms. Zaletel, who is going to begin speaking regarding the use of force policy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought I would introduce it quickly, and then we have a lineup of speakers to speak to it, including the police department, APDEA, Charlene Akpak, Taria Ware, and Celeste. So first, if you're okay with you, go ahead and do a quick introduction, and then we'll invite them to speak.
Yep, I'll just hand it over to you. Go ahead.
Thank you. So AO 2020-80 is a policy, or is an ordinance to codify the APD's use of force policies and procedures, and the intent of the ordinance is to just do that, to codify the policies and procedures so that if a change in the future was to be made, it would be subject to the public process. I know there's specific feedback that we're going to hear today on really both sides, and as to the substance of the policy and procedure, or what's in the ordinance. And so I look forward to that conversation. And with that, I'd be happy to turn it over to whoever we have from APD. I believe it's supposed to be the chief.
Great. And Ms. Zaletel, before we go on, I just want to recognize that we've been joined by Member Constant and Member Weddleton. And Chief Dahl, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. You know, I totally understand and appreciate that the community is interested in how the police department does business, and And we're very interested in having that community engagement. Anytime that we have the public interested in the department and how we do things, from our perspective, that's a good thing. And I've always believed that, you know, even as a first line supervisor and as I've sort of worked my way up through APD, we should always be able to explain why we do what we do. So if someone asks us, how did this happen? Why do you do things this way? That's something that we should be able to explain. And if we can't explain it, we should probably consider changing it or at least be looking at it. And so, you know, when you talk about police department policies and procedures, at least at APD, what that means is we have written policies that say the police department will do whatever this task is in a lawful, professional, compassionate manner, or, you know, whatever is relevant to the task at hand. And then typically they're followed by a procedure, which is almost like a step-by-step for our frontline staff on how to get whatever that task is done. And whenever, like, the magic of policy writing is that you have to write those guidelines in a way that covers as many things as you can think of, but with some flexibility to recognize the fact that there's no way I'm ever going to write a rule for the police department that covers every possible contingency that an officer might confront during the course of their duties. So that's kind of how they're structured. Putting an operational policy like use of force in municipal code is basically the opposite of that. It hard codes it. In this case, it's being considered for being encoded in the municipal criminal code. And so it completely lacks all of that flexibility that we need in order to be able to do our jobs on a daily basis. It's pretty much the opposite of everything we try to do with policy. It lacks the flexibility, and frankly, it makes it difficult to change. For example, the use of force policy we changed recently because we recognized it included some techniques in it that were frankly no longer reasonable for a police department to engage in, like a vascular restraint, which is a type of neck hold. And so we were able to make that change immediately instead of taking months or longer to get it done, because it just didn't make sense anymore. And it was something the community wasn't going to support, and it frankly isn't a good operational tactic for a police department in 2020 because we have a lot of other effective tools, and so we made that change quickly. The other issue with trying to put an operational guideline like this in municipal code is that frankly it's difficult to write something like this if you're not a subject matter expert, and I think that the current draft of 2020-80 is a good example of that. You know, I've had some communication with Ms. Zalatel. I know that she's coming from a place of just trying to simply sort of preserve what the police department's already doing. But the draft actually contains sweeping changes to the way that we would do business on a daily basis that I think are unintended. But it's a good example of why having a legislative body try to create operational guidelines for frontline staff is really challenging and difficult. You know, I think recently the police department's been very good about being open and transparent about what we do, how we do it. We've recently placed almost all of our policies online. In the last few, there's I think less than 7 left to go that we're just tuning up a little bit. We'll definitely be up before September 1st. So the public can review them. Those policies are part of our policy keeping system, the public portal is. And so anytime that we change them, they'll automatically be changed in the public facing portal as well. And so anyone can see when our policies change and then have a dialogue with the police department about that. And that's really the right way for the community to be engaged in the police department's policies, is that open dialogue with the department about why we're doing what we're doing. You know, what's the community expectation for the department? But even that could be hampered by trying to set some of these out in code. It really just, it totally undermines our ability to be flexible, have those things be open for discussion and changed when necessary. And so I think that we've been good about that. I think that that visibility exists. We're now required to have them online in that way, which I think is frankly, it's a good thing for the police department and the community as a whole. But given all of those things that I see as issues with an attempt to codify an operational guideline like this, I have to say that the police department is vehemently opposed to this or any operational policy being placed in municipal code. And I really can't support this ordinance or any version of it. I think it will, the lack of flexibility that it introduces into our operations will absolutely have a negative impact on public safety. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I promised that I would keep it relatively short, so I'll end it there. You know, we're always happy to continue talking about the police department and how we do the things we do, and continuing with our community engagement. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I will mute myself.
Thank you, Chief. I do have a question for you, Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief, thank you for your comments, but there are some very specific things in here. And I think just for purposes of reassuring the public that these particular things are handled in such a way that everybody believes is reasonable and rational. Can you touch on the portions of the potential ordinance here that actually speaks to things like warning shots and shooting at or from moving vehicles? And you know, you mentioned a little bit about the constraints and vascular holds and whatever, but there's a lot of things on this list that people think are pretty are things that really should be basic policies, basic regulations. So can you speak to some of them, please, and kind of give us why it's already covered or why we can't go down this route, or anyway, comments, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good point. Most of this is covered in some way in the existing policy, but unfortunately the draft has sort of altered it in a lot of ways that make it, frankly, almost impossible for us to comply with. For example, warning shots. Our officers are prohibited from firing warning shots. We don't allow that. Shooting at or from a moving vehicle. Our policy says that other than under extenuating circumstances, officers shall not fire at or from a moving vehicle unless such use of deadly force is justified by something other than the threat from the moving vehicle. Such discharges will be rigorously scrutinized. Officers should avoid tactics that could place them in a position where a vehicle could be used against them. When confronted with an oncoming moving vehicle, officers must attempt to move out of its path and should generally avoid placing themselves in situations where the use of deadly force is more likely. So this is basically written to be like, we don't want you shooting at or from moving vehicles. If that happens for some reason, you better be prepared to explain it in depth, because we generally prohibit it. But also, we recognize the fact that I can't anticipate every single possible thing that could happen on the street. So basically, just be forewarned, if you do this, it's going to be under a microscope, because it's just, and frankly, this is a section of our policy that in the early 2000s, we had a series of officers shooting at vehicles. They placed themselves in harm's way, where then they were about to be run over by the vehicle, and then they shot into it. The department did not think that was acceptable behavior from our officers, and so this is the policy that was created as a result. But again, you know, there's a little bit of flexibility left in there that, you know, because we can't anticipate every possible outcome, but we have the ability to review it after the fact and impose sanctions if the behavior is incorrect, up to and including criminal prosecution. There's a section that says shooting when innocent bystanders are near the line of fire to create a substantial risk of harm. So from the very first day that our officers begin handling firearms, they're taught 4 firearm safety rules. And the 4th rule is be sure of the target as well as the surroundings. And what that means is basically what that says. And our policy says when officers are about to discharge their firearms, they should be aware of their field of fire, including the backstop, so as to not unnecessarily create a substantial risk of harm to innocent persons. Officers are prohibited from discharging their firearms when, based on the totality of the circumstances, discharging a firearm would constitute a greater risk to human life than the subject's actions. Excuse me. So discharging, for example, discharging a firearm into a crowded vehicle or a vehicle in a crowded area, or a person in a crowded area. So again, this is something that's already covered not only by our policy, but basically every moment of firearms training that an officer ever engages in. This is something that's reinforced. But the way that this particular section is written would unnecessarily restrict that, because again, there are things that you just can't anticipate, and you need to allow for that flexibility for officers to make decisions on the fly in the real world, knowing that we're going to review it after the fact, and frankly, with a lot of scrutiny to their actions, and and second guess what they did quite a bit, which is a very difficult position for them to be in already. Drawing and pointing weapons unless deadly force is authorized. Our policy says officers are prohibited from pointing their firearms at or in the direction of a person absent an objectively reasonable determination that the situation may escalate to the point where deadly force would be authorized under this policy. And when you hear objectively reasonable in our policies, that usually means that this is something that we're taking from a court decision on police use of force. So we're following the applicable law. When it's determined that the use of deadly force is not necessary, officers shall, as soon as practicable, secure or holster their firearms. It's the rule of this department that drawing a firearm and pointing it at a subject is considered a use of force, and as a result, it's required to be documented and reviewed. Use of firearms to destroy animals is prohibited under the draft ordinance. That's living in Alaska, that's kind of hard to imagine. We respond regularly to animals that have been struck on the roadway and need to be put down. And so I'm not even sure what we would do if that were something that we couldn't do anymore. Our policy says officers may use deadly force against an animal that represents a threat to the public or to the officer's safety, or as a humanitarian reason where the animal is seriously injured and the officers have received authorization from the animal's owner to the extent practicable, and the officer's supervisor. There are lots of other examples. We all know that we have very large wildlife that lives inside the municipality that occasionally threatens or kills Anchorage residents. And so in some way, limiting officers' ability to respond and reasonably deal with that is hard to imagine. There's some mention of deadly force being necessary, objectively reasonable under the circumstances, and then restricting chokeholds and some other stuff. Our policy on non-deadly force restrictions is that the following tactics of non-deadly force may be permitted in circumstances only when deadly force is authorized by this policy. Any chokehold, vascular neck restraint, any strike with an impact weapon or object to a person's head or neck, any use of flashlights, radios, or any other item not issued or trained specifically as a defensive weapon. So basically, none of those things are allowed, and unless deadly force is authorized. And I think, as most people can imagine, if an officer is faced with a situation where deadly force is authorized, virtually anything that an officer can do to resolve that situation is authorized. As long as it's reasonable, objectively reasonable, and survives the second look in both the criminal and administrative investigation that is guaranteed to follow. Number 7 is sitting or kneeling or standing on the chest or back of a person in a manner that compresses the diaphragm for longer than reasonably necessary to restrain the person. There's a lot of information that suggests that the safest way to restrain somebody is by holding them on the ground and not letting them flail around, strike officers, or otherwise injure themselves or other people. And I think this restriction, again, kind of comes from a place of, I sort of understand why we're having this discussion after George Floyd, but I think there's a big difference between restraining somebody on the ground and kneeling on somebody's neck for almost 9 minutes. And there's no way that type of situation would be viewed as reasonable under our existing use of force policy. And then it says, under no circumstances shall deadly force be authorized against a person in handcuffs or restrained to any extent. Again, that is, our policy says force shall not be used against persons in handcuffs except as objectively reasonable to prevent imminent bodily harm to the officer or another person or persons, or to prevent escape, or is objectively reasonable where physical removal is unnecessary to overcome passive resistance. So really, again, when you hear that objectively reasonable, those are taken from court decisions. And what that says is that you can't use deadly force against somebody who's in handcuffs unless they're doing something that makes that deadly force authorized, like they've taken some kind of action where they're threatening the life of another person. And you might think, oh, well, if somebody's handcuffed behind their back, they could never do that. And you know, it's probably unlikely that they could. But there are a lot of people that can slip their handcuffs around to the front and have in the past done that, and then fought with an officer and taken a weapon away, or taken control of a vehicle, or lots of other things. And so again, that sort of restriction is not reasonable. It really doesn't follow existing case law, and it places unnecessary restrictions on officers who are already having to make decisions in, you know, matters of fractions of a second in the field. And it's just not reasonable. And so that kind of takes us through the end. So I think the point that I would make after sort of reading through all that, and I know it's a lot of information, is that all of the things that are lined out in 2020-80 are essentially already covered in our existing use of force policy in a way that complies with the law and with best practice on policing to keep our officers safe, but also minimize the risk to either innocent bystanders or even the criminal suspects to any sort of injury. And, you know, again, I really can't support this in any way, because I think that the draft itself makes a lot of changes that are things that are just not reasonable, and are things that would be impossible for us to comply with operationally. But it unreasonably restricts our ability to adapt in the future. Mr. Kennedy, did I hit the things that you were looking for?
You did. Thank you, Chief. Yeah, I really do appreciate the run through on all those, because they're definitely specific, and I just really appreciate the feedback and the explanation. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yep, thanks. That was very, very helpful. And I don't see any other questions in the queue. So Chief, thank you so much for your presentation and for the information that you shared. Ms. Zalatel, who do we have next up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have Jeremy Conkling from APDEA.
Okay, Jeremy, you're up.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to come and chat with you guys a little about this, be invited to the process. I'm the president of the Anchorage Police Department Employees Association, and I'm a sergeant at the Anchorage Police Department. I just want to expand a little bit on what the chief says. I agree with everything that he said, but I want to identify a couple key areas in which I think that this ordinance the idea behind it is already being addressed internally, and I think it'll hamper the public safety here in Anchorage and the ability of the officers to do the job that we have charged them to do. I agree with the flexibility portion. The court cases come down almost on a weekly basis. We have changes in best practices in policing and training all across the country that are being implemented, and having our policies not in a municipal ordinance, but in living documents that can be adjusted and changed on the fly is incredibly important. The chief touched a little bit on how in our policies it uses the term objectively reasonable. And where that comes from is a Supreme Court case. It was decided in 1989. It's got 30 plus years now of being upheld by courts all across the country. It's called Graham v. Connor. And that is the case where the court said, this is how we are going to view police use of force. And it is through the lens of whether or not it was objectively reasonable. And that's what our policy is modeled off of. That's what our training is modeled off of. When I read through the ordinance, I just want to provide some specific feedback. Like the chief said, shooting at or from a moving vehicle is prohibited in our current policy, but with the extenuating factor, extenuating circumstances clause. If a person is driving a vehicle into a crowd of people, like we've seen at many demonstrations and protests all across the country and all across the world over the last 10, 15, 20 years, we at that point in time, we only have one opportunity and one option. It is not the time to negotiate with that person. It is not the time to try and move people out of the way. We have one way to solve that problem. And if our national law and our state law and our police best practices tell us at that point in time, the only option is deadly force against the driver of that vehicle, and our municipal ordinance is contrary to that, I don't think any of us want our officers in a decision or to have the decision at that point in time where they decide, do I let people die? Do I violate municipal law? What do I do? At that point in time, they need to react, and they're trained to react, and they receive some of the best training in the country in how to deal with those situations. The clause in the ordinance about shooting when innocent bystanders are near the line of fire, I'll expand on that a little bit, that when you read that, there's no scienter element there. So even if the officers didn't know that innocent bystanders were near the line of fire, they would technically be in violation of this ordinance and subject to a misdemeanor charge for that. The drawing and pointing weapons unless deadly force is authorized by police department policy. We have training, again, that is based on case law, that is based on real world circumstances for our officers to draw their weapons. Some of you in this room went through training with APD in 2018, where we explained to you why we draw our weapons when we search a building. And you got to experience, for lack of a better term there, sort of some of what the officers deal with when they go into an unknown scenario like that. And we don't know that deadly force is going to be authorized, but as a few of you got to experience, sometimes that decision happens so quickly. Somebody comes out of a back room with a weapon in their hand or pulls a knife on you, or you're on a canine track for searching for a dangerous felon. What we've seen and what has been shown is that when we have our guns out, that can actually reduce the likelihood that we need to use deadly force, because people respond usually very differently when our weapons are out versus when they're not. And placing officers behind the power curve and forcing them into a situation where somebody else could draw a gun on them or a weapon on them and hurt them endangers our officers and it endangers our public safety as well. I think the chief hit on the use of firearms to destroy animals, so I'll skip over that. The next part where it talks about deadly force being authorized, necessary, and objectively reasonable. Again, this comes straight from Supreme Court verbiage. This is the Graham v. Connor case, except for the term necessary. That changes the way in which we would have to view our use of force, and that would be contrary to not only federal law, but state law and best practices. So that sort of language is problematic. And then lastly, under no circumstances shall deadly force be authorized against a person in handcuffs. We see on almost a weekly, if not monthly basis, how handcuffed suspects can present a threat to officers and to the public. I believe it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think it was Chicago, a handcuffed suspect managed to disarm an officer and get a hold of a weapon. In San Diego a couple weeks ago, in the backseat of a police car, a suspect manages to slip his handcuffs to the front, crawl out the window, and get the officers, try to get the officer's rifle dislodged from the front seat of their car. And so in codifying actions by police, we work and we live in the gray area. That's what we tell all of our police officers, is that very rarely in police work are we going to say never and always, because we are dealing with humans, and it is in a very usually emotionally charged situation, and our officers are humans as well. And so we train them consistently with the best practices. We train them with what the law is now, but we also need to leave them the ability to do the job that we've trained, hired, and equipped them to do, and that is to critically analyze the situation and use their discretion. And when we take that away, when we legislate discretion away from our police officers, that in the end of the day hampers our ability to safely, to keep the public safe and to keep our officers safe for that matter. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. If not, I appreciate the time that you've allotted me.
Jeremy, thanks so much for your presentation. That was great. I don't see any questions in the queue. And so, again, thank you for your time and your presentation. Ms. Zalatil, who do we have next up to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have Charlene Ockbach, please.
Okay, Charlene, you're up.
Good afternoon. Oh, not quite afternoon. Good morning, everyone. Charlene Ockbach here, and I really appreciate being invited into the space and hearing the remarks that we've heard so far. And pardon me. Before I jump into some of the comments that I had, I want to take the opportunity to respond to the example that Mr. Cockling presented with a vehicle being driven into a crowd, for example, and having restrictions possibly from something like this limiting police officers. But the example provided exactly what the community is often worried about, is that the immediate response that was given would be shooting that person. And so I wonder things like, what comes to mind is, why wouldn't the response be to shoot the tires? And so, we can spend a lot of time on line by line and example after example. But I think the biggest thing that I would like to comment on is that the idea, and I appreciate, the leadership and Chief Justin Dahl and others who have worked hard to put the policies online and made publicly available. And of course, we have a shared understanding that the idea of transparency, and the reason that we do that, is to consistently be on a path of improving ourselves and holding our public servants accountable, so that everyone feels safe, including the community. So a lot of what I'm hearing in response to this ordinance is protecting the police officers, which of course is valued and important. But I feel like we're missing the other part, is ensuring that the community feels safe at all times as well. So what I'm looking at when we've gone in lots of detail over these different points, but I'd like to speak to more broadly about the idea of and the intention of having this codified. So some of the questions, and again, I'm not an expert, but one of the questions I'm hearing is trying to understand how APD policy is made. So we're hearing a lot of flexibility and responsiveness from our local department, which is wonderful. But also what that raises questions about is if we're able to swiftly adapt our policies to be responsive, that it also might feel like to community members from the outset that they're able to swiftly adapt policies to protect themselves and behaviors that, we're not seeing accountability being held to. And so one of the, ideas of codifying this is to have that extra layer of accountability that isn't just policy that's very fluid, that doesn't hold accountability to police officers in different scenarios where the community feels their voices and their experience isn't being represented. So I have a lot of questions per usual, but I don't want to, I want to definitely honor everybody's time, and I know that there's more people on queue to this. So one of the questions would be, how is, APD policy and procedures made? The other thing that I'm hearing is that, a lot of emphasis on the terms objectively reasonable. And so if that is, we've heard why that has been put into place. And I'm wondering if it seems reasonable then that as these ordinances are introduced, if we could, of course, amend what we have in draft form right here and make sure that if the assembly would like to move forward with having an ordinance such as this, that we can make sure that those words objectively reasonable are in there, and if that would be amenable to the chief and others who are currently opposed to this. The other questions I have are around things being documented and reviewed. And so again, if we see policies that are being written by the employees themselves, that and then we also see documentation and reviewed being also internal, again, it raises a lot of questions from the community. So those are some of my, I'm kind of stepping back a little bit away from the specific draft that we have right now and asking some questions about where we can have, middle ground on this. And what I'm hearing is, important language around being reasonable, because again, we hope that some of these incidences are few and far between. And that, how often are these things going to be taking place where, that there would be worry about this being in code, that also kind of raises a flag. Is this happening so frequently that this is going to be problematic? So those are some of my comments and questions. The other, I'll save the rest, but yeah, thank you for the opportunity to comment, and I appreciate the leadership that we have here locally. And I feel really positive and hopeful about how we can find middle ground on moving things forward. So, Koyana.
Thank you, Charlene. I have a couple of people in the queue. I will say that we're writing down these questions, and so if we don't get to all the questions that we will make sure to follow up with folks on answers to them. I have member Constant in the queue, but I also have Jeremy who wants to respond directly to this. So Jeremy, if you could do a quick response to her question, and then I'll have member Constant speak. So Jeremy, do you want to do a quick response?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Real quick on the tire situation. The reason why the response at that point is to use deadly force upon the driver is shooting out tires doesn't stop a vehicle. Shooting out an engine doesn't stop a vehicle. We do not carry weapons that are capable of doing that. And so that's why I think it circles back to the chief's point where perhaps at APD, we need to do some better education with the public as to why we do what we do. But that's the sort of issue where if it ends up in an ordinance, it prevents us from doing our fundamental job, and that's keeping the public safe. And then on the accountability aspect, the chief mentioned how our policies are currently structured. And then an officer goes outside of that policy, anytime an officer uses force that is above compliant handcuffing. So anytime an officer says, put your hands behind your back, and that suspect does anything other than put their hands behind their back, that use of force is documented. It is in a police report. They go through a review process by their sergeant. And then if it is a significant use of force, a taser, a canine bite, a physical strike, anything that rises to the level like that, they actually undergo an internal use of force review board where several commanders sit and hear from the sergeant who investigated the use of force what happened and why it happened, and then they make a determination as to whether or not we need to adjust our training or whether or not that was outside of policy. So we have several layers of review already within our current department and in our current structure to hold our officers accountable. So that was all I had. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. And but before I have Mr. Constant, again, Charlene had a number of questions, and I want to make sure that she knows that those were heard, and that we may not have time to get to them today, but I want to make sure that we get back to her on all of those. Mr. Constant, you'd like to speak?
Yeah, thank you. It's a two-part question, part for the chief and part for Ms. Epoch, Charlene. The first part, Chief, is has there been any history with the department that you're aware of working on policies with the Public Safety Advisory Commission? It seems to me that there's an opportunity there to have this group working at some regular interval or semi-regular interval to ensure that there is a public eye that has a focus on the mission. So do you have any recollection of working with that body?
Thank you, Mr. Constant. I believe in the past we have done that and worked with them. I think we've also talked with the Police Community Relations Task Force regarding APD policies and taken input that way. And I think it's important to note that, I mean, we're constantly taking the public's feedback into consideration when we're crafting and reviewing policies. I mean, the use of force policy change example that I gave a few minutes ago, from where we just recently changed that policy. I mean, that's a direct result of public feedback. The community made it abundantly clear that that was a technique that was not going to be palatable to anybody in the community that we serve, and we changed it. So I mean, that does happen pretty regularly.
And Charlene, my question for you is, have you had a chance to meet with the Public Safety Advisory Commission yet?
Hi, we have a meeting this afternoon.
Okay, very good. I'm hopeful that whatever process we come up with, maybe every quarter or at some regular interval, that commission would consider doing a review with APD on policies and policy changes over that timeline. Anyhow, thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you. And I just wanted to make a note that some of the points that Charlene made in terms of how is policy made and who's involved in that is still out there for me to get answers to. This idea of policies being focused on officer safety versus public safety and how we reconcile that. The idea of whether we can include objectively reasonable into this ordinance, whether that is an option or not. This idea of people creating policies for themselves, and how do we make sure that they're held accountable, and a number of other points that we want to make sure that we hit. But in our remaining time, I want to make sure we get all of our speakers in. Ms. Zalatil, who do you have next up to speak?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Taria Ware is next.
As I'm connecting things.
Oh, yep.
Okay, wonderful.
Taria.
Hello, everyone. So I am the current secretary of the NAACP, and we are so happy to be a part of the conversation. Grateful that we're having the conversation as a community, and that we really feel like the actions that are being seen by the municipality are being progressive and preventative, and actually supportive of the current APD PMPs. We've seen it played out continuously, that law enforcement is not connecting, that the law is not protecting the community members when there is misconduct regarding police officers, and that Anchorage can support APD with their current PMPs while supporting the community to be able to have the recourse if unforeseen issues may occur. Our national law is obviously flawed, and systematic racism is apparent in every system, but especially just the disparity is clear in criminal justice. On national level, there are already conversations on how policies need to be changed. And so although there are references to Supreme Court decisions and numerous other case law in where officers are supported in their tactics, I think recently we are seeing more of a question on why is that supported and should that be supported, and how can we support law enforcement in what they do, but still feel as a community that we're supported. Obviously everybody knows, the most recent names, but just to, name a few names that you might not know, where every killing that was justified was Dylan Taylor, David Hooks, Akai Gurley, John Crawford, Romaine Bryson, and numerous other names. But regardless of that, a mother, brother, sister, father was dead, and that person will never be a community member again. We also know that our police officers are community members, and we'd like them to be safe and go home too. But the disparity becomes when more of the community members don't make it home, but the police officers do. So again, I would like this ordinance, we want to say that we want to support our local police department and find that middle ground. And I think this conversation kind of goes to that. I would like to say, though, that we are in support with Chief Dole as far as like the ordinance number 6, which addresses the use of force regarding animals, that does seem to be sufficient for the community. So removing number 6 would be something that we are in support of. We definitely all have encountered moose and bear and things, and sometimes those animals need to be dealt with. I think on our executive team committee, I don't know anybody who's going to be addressing moose and bear themselves. So the committee we feel should also delve deeper into the policies and procedures of APD to create transparency and reestablish the relationship with the community. And they did do that in some part by listing, their policies and procedures, which they did not have to do, which begs the question, if there was another appointed chief, would they also allow the policies to be, presented in such a manner on the website? Or would they say, oh, it doesn't need to be there? Things do change with the changing of the guard. And so when you have something in an ordinance, those things don't change without community involvement. We would like to see the data, regarding the total number of use of force incidents, the number of officers that were involved in those use of force, the demographics, specifics regarding those things. If there is data that is already being collected, then as a community, can we see that? How do we see that? Who do we ask? I'm hopeful that as we move forward, data could be made available and that informed courses of actions could be made. Maybe everything is doing well and the data will represent that. Maybe there are some things that we can do better. And Chief Dole and his team would say, hey, this is areas we feel we could do better. And just having that transparency in that conversation. Data usually is not able to be skewed. So I feel like that renews the faith in the community in their law enforcement when they have numbers that kind of are able to correlate to that. Approving this ordinance, though, should not wait for that data. The data should be a part of future conversations by the committee. But by approving this ordinance, we believe it holds APD accountable in new ways that will make the public feel secure. Is it an end all be all? No, this is the start of a conversation and one that we are happy Anchorage is having. It will also make the community more aware of changes that happen to the use of force policy. As Chief Dole mentioned, they changed something recently. I don't necessarily remember seeing that change posted, but then again, if you're not looking in certain places, sometimes things get lost. And so, but when there is an ordinance change, everyone knows about it, it's posted, it has a certain comment period. There is a process in place to where the community can be engaged in that process. We have other ordinances that the community is allowed to be aware of. So why couldn't we be aware of the changes that are affecting the lives of our community members? For those that say this is too restrictive, one of the comments could be that this is directly from their current PMPs. This is the guidelines that have already been laid out, other than number 6, which we asked to definitely be amended. These are things that they're saying they can and will do and have done. So I feel like it is more holding the police officers who are part of this community, who are community members, accountable just like every other community member for their action. Transparency does not stop incidents from occurring, nor does it help officers to be prosecuted when misconduct arises. If there are no requirements for APD under a municipal code, then how can the community be sure that the expectation will not change with the changing of an appointed official? I'm hopeful that future conversations regarding the public safety involve possible body cameras in their strategic plan for APD moving forward in the next coming years. We understand this is a huge financial undertaking, but even as you're strategically planning 3, 5 years, 10 years, to put that in there as that is a part of the intention moving forward. And again, it helps build that faith again into our law enforcement team. For those on the committee, if you've ever wanted resources or more knowledge, the Center for Policing and Equity has a wealth of toolkits and knowledge and different kind of laws and things that they have done across the nation to help with equity in policing. And I'm sure our very own APD and APDEA are well aware of it. Annual documented trainings. I understand they are supposed to do trainings, but I haven't really seen the documentation and the fact that it actually is happening annually. We get so busy. I would like to make sure that implicit bias and verbal tactics and verbal judo or adolescent brain development or mental health training, that those are actually occurring on an annual basis. One of the questions outside of the NAACP that I personally have, I understand a trauma that occurs, and understanding trauma, officers see a lot of things every day. And we do psychological testing in order to be on the police force, which is amazing because a lot of other police forces do not do that. But do we actually do psychological testing after an incident, a year after the incident, 5 years after the incident? So that was one of the questions that I had. I do think this is the right time to talk about preventative measures that Anchorage can take so we don't have incidents that can be prevented. And I really appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you so much for your comments. Really appreciate it. Making sure I can see all of these. Let's see. Charlene, thank you for posting that into the chat. That's helpful. We only have a few minutes left. Ms. Zolotel, do we have another speaker?
We are on our last speaker, Mr. Chair. Celeste Hodge-Groden is our final speaker for today.
Great. Celeste, you're up. Welcome.
All right. Great. Thank you very much. So good morning again. My name is Celeste Hodge-Groden, and many of you have heard this already. 30 years in the civil rights arena, advocating for the rights of people as former NAACP president, as former executive director of Shiloh Community Development, Inc., as former director of equal opportunity for the municipality of Anchorage, and currently as the president and CEO of the Alaska Black Caucus. The Alaska Black Caucus believes the proposed ordinance is definitely a step in the right direction. Do we need to possibly tweak in some areas? Probably so. But at the same time, this moves us forward. And let me just say that there is a need for language around the use of chemical agents. And what I mean by that is chemical agents not be used in crowded areas without clear and safe egress, in closed or poorly ventilated areas, or to effect the arrest of a person that is passively resisting. That no airborne chemical agents be used without occupied treatment areas of medical facilities. That all use of force data be available for public review in some way, perhaps through a website or via the Citizens Review Board that I've recommended so many times already, to monitor for disproportionate use, morbidity, and mortality of racial or other marginalized groups, like individuals with disabilities and those experiencing a mental health crisis. This data needs to be collected accurately and completely for appropriate review that can then shape future policy recommendations and for appropriate improvements. And I have so many notes here from all of the different testimonies, and I believe that a work session is in order. But there were so many comments. Chief Dole talked about being placed under a microscope, with some of the decisions that might have to be made. Well, what's wrong with being under a microscope? What's wrong with having the community know what's happening and to take another look at what's happening within the police department? After all, the police department is part of this community, and we are part of this community as well. I say all of this to say I hope that the Citizen Review Board recommended will also support meaningful change, as there still seems to be so much reliance, both within internal police department policies and within the law, on actions that are objectively reasonable or necessary from the perspective of police officers. We know that, unfortunately, what is upheld as reasonable and necessary and objective judgment is too often based on implicit biases and racist ideas that disproportionately harm Black and Indigenous people. Yes, even in Alaska. There was also comments about this particular ordinance. And, I just don't understand why it is we can't work from here, tweak what we need to tweak, and move on. So that concludes my comments. I thank you for the opportunity. And I'm looking forward to working together with APD to make something that is meaningful for everybody.
Thank you, Celeste, very much for your comments, and thank you to all the speakers. We only have about 5 minutes left. I want to make a couple of quick comments. I don't have anybody in the queue to speak, so I'm going to take the opportunity to say a few things. One is that you know, I'll follow up with Ms. Patel and talk about what our next steps are, and that may be a work session. I would agree with some of the comments that we need to figure out how we can work from here. And my final statement is really to address our item C, and it relates directly to the conversation we're having. On the Public Safety Committee, we are developing a long list of items that we need to address as the committee, within the departments, within the municipality, and the municipality as a whole. We're working on that list, and that list was generated from the comments that we've been getting from the community, and that will be developed and posted on our site. And so we have right now 24 different items that are on that list. So we'll make sure that that's up soon. And as a follow-up, we want to make sure that we're responding to many of the questions that were asked today. So we've written those down, and we'll make sure to respond to those as well. And we'll get with the chief and other assembly members to make sure that those are addressed. With the remaining time, I don't know if necessarily we have time to hit the rest of the items. Ms. Kennedy, do you have any closing comments that you'd like to make before we adjourn?
I thought I was in the queue too.
Well, I don't
Mr.
see.
Chair, go till 12:30. And
Are we till 12:30?
Correct. And
Oh, sorry.
it
That's right.
looks like we might have Mrs. Zolotel has a follow-up to wrap up, and then we still have half an hour. We can go on to the rest of the agenda.
Right.
Thanks.
I apologize to everyone. I thought we were ending at 12. Okay, Ms. Zolotel, would you like to do a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this item is set for public hearing on the 25th. Right now, as the sponsor, it's my intent to take the questions back, the feedback, and work through that with the folks here and others who are interested in working on this item and seeing where we're at closer to the 25th. It was always my anticipation that we'd likely have an S version of this ordinance. This was a starting point for a conversation. If that S version isn't ready by the 25th, we'll again look to push out for public hearing. So I just wanted to provide that context as to the next steps we're going to be moving forward. And if there are members interested in working in this area, I invite your participation, or that if there are other community groups or individuals we need to be including in this conversation, please reach out and let me know. And I look forward to the continued work. Thank you, Ms. Kennedy and Mr. Perez-Verdia, for accommodating us in your committee today.
Thank you. And just as a reminder, so you want folks to reach out to you if they want to get involved in this and get their questions answered and participate moving forward. Is that correct?
That's correct. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Well, I'm so happy that we have an additional half hour that I was not aware of. So we're going to move on to our second item, a discussion regarding audit and maintenance issues in the Anchorage Fire Department. Do we have someone representing the fire department on the call today?
Good afternoon, Assemblymember Perez-Verdia. Chief Hedrick here to answer any questions.
Great. Well, what we would start with is if you have an update for us regarding the audit and maintenance issues that were discussed in the past, and sort of where those are at, and what your strategy is moving forward.
So unfortunately, we once the audit was complete and I presented to the audit committee, I shared the fact that we did select a new supervisor to manage the shop. However, that person was then subsequently deployed for the military, and he will not be back until October. So certain changes that we need to make cannot take place until he returns to the office. The other other half of this is we have made some progress when it comes to emergency vehicle technician training, which is one of the sites from the audit was that some of our people did not have the required certifications. And last week they were in class for quite a few hours to pursue certification across the board at the appropriate emergency vehicle technician level. So that's really the only progress we've made at this point because we're waiting for the supervisor to get back, and we're marking off those things that we can get to before he returns.
Okay, great. Wonderful. So we can work with you offline to schedule a time when you would like to come back to the committee and give us an update on progress that has been made. Does that work for you?
That works for us, and I'm guessing we're probably talking the December meeting.
Okay, great. All right, I don't see any questions or comments in the queue regarding the audit and maintenance issues. So thank you, Chief, for your time, and thank you for being here. Appreciate the update.
All right, thank you.
All right, so I'm going to move on to our third item, item C, Public Safety Committee priorities and plan for the future. We have a draft list that has been developed from primarily from our last meeting, where we brought members of the community in and brought the police department in to talk specifically about what are the issues that need to be addressed. That list right now has 24 different items on it that are it's our intention to use that as essentially a to-do list that we would post on our site, and we would also post action or resolution or progress that has been made towards each of those issues, and that we can continue to add to it. But it's a way of us to sort of chart out the work that we're going to be doing over the next year, and making sure that we're communicating with the internal departments and with the community in terms of making sure that the issues that we've been brought are being addressed. I won't read through all of those, but many of them have been addressed in some of the comments that were shared today. And we wanted to give an update that list again will be posted on the site, and will be used as a running to-do list for the committee. Ms. Kennedy, did you have anything else you wanted to add related to the running list of priorities and plan for the Public Safety Committee?
Well, yes, thank you. I was just going to put in the queue that I kind of wanted to comment on this. It is a long list, and to a certain extent, some of the phrases that are in here may not exactly capture what people are trying to ask for. So I'm actually wondering if there's a better way to kind of put this list out so we can fine tune it a little bit and maybe put it towards some kind of action item that the Public Safety Committee could really work toward. Because I think some of these things are, there's not very well developed thoughts in terms of giving direction for what this committee should be doing. So, right. Maybe there's a process in between here before we put this list up on the website in terms of kind of our checklist, turning it into a checklist. Maybe there's a way of getting this narrowed down and getting it to be a little more descriptive in terms of what we're going to do. So maybe the idea would be to send this list, or maybe go ahead and post the list and have people comment on it and say, how do we turn these into actionable items that this committee could work on? And then we'll formulate the list and keep it a running list that we can check off as we accomplish these things. So.
Yeah, I think that's right, because it ranges from, and I'll just read through a few of them. Need recognition of historical harms done to Black people, address current racism and oppose all forms of white supremacy, create and codify citizen review board, create a comprehensive plan to address structural oppression, require cultural diversity training for APD, publish SRO statistics, consider reparations at a city scale. And it goes on and on. And so some of them are specific things that we can do follow-up work on and investigate and learn more about. Some of them are pieces of advice that were given to us. And so I think it's a good idea to send this list out to the committee and for us to get feedback from the committee on it, and structure it in a way that it will communicate exactly what we plan to do, and also, as I said, show that that we are actively responding to the feedback that we've received from the community. So we'll do that. We'll get it out to the committee and hopefully get feedback from all of you prior to posting it up on the website. So before I go on, is there any comments or questions about that public safety committee priorities and plan for the future, that running list? All right, seeing none, we're going to move on to item D in our agenda, recap from alcohol tax town halls. I see a question, where can we find that list? We will be posting that list on the municipal website in the Public Safety Committee section. So look for that relatively soon. We're going to do, I think, a little cleaning up of it. It's as member Kennedy said, it's a little wordy and disorganized at this point, so we needed to clean it up so it communicates really clearly. But I would assume that we can get it onto the website within the next week. So moving on, I would like to ask members of this committee to share their reflections from the town hall meetings, specifically related to public safety. And I hate to put folks on the spot, but I'd like to get some feedback from folks, because it's our hope to share recommendations from the Public Safety Committee on how we move forward. So if we could just go around and whoever wants to start, but are there reflections from committee members of the Assembly from the town hall meetings that you think are important that this committee should be looking at in terms of recommendations? And if I don't hear any volunteers, I'm going to call on you. Why don't we start with our chair, Mr. Rivera? Do you have any sort of feedback or reflections you'd like to share with the committee from the town hall meetings?
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure we have Mr. Rivera with us
Okay.
for this meeting. I think he's attending a different meeting right now.
Okay, great. Well, we'll move on. I do know that Ms. Zolotil is on. Ms. Zolotil, do you have any reflections or thoughts for the committee related to the use of the alcohol tax and related to public safety?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me, and I'm going to have to sign off here shortly, so thank you for letting me speak now. When it comes to public safety, I think we need to broaden our traditional views of public safety and really look at public health as, Ms. LaFrance would say, the third piece to that public safety stool. And while I appreciate the work of the core team in particular, it's my recommendation that we really look instead to do mental health first response, consistent with and support that with alcohol tax revenues, particularly with regard to getting mental health first responders out there to respond to the calls that APD is currently being asked to respond to, that sometimes not providing the most strategic response leads to someone actually falling into the core team's purview of being a high utilizer, really just getting the right response out to the right kind of call. While I support the alcohol tax doing this work, I do think over time, if we are strategic about it, the funding source for that work could later be reduced using 1115 Medicaid waiver strategies and others. But that would be my recommendation, a slight diversion from where the Public Safety Committee was when we did talk about it, the different proposals at the town halls. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Zolotil. Going down my list, Mr. Constant, do you have feedback or reflections from the town hall meetings that you'd like to share with the committee that help us to make recommendations moving forward? All right. I don't hear anything from Mr. Constant. I'm going to move forward. Ms. Quinn Davidson, do you have any reflections or thoughts you'd like to share related to the town halls for the alcohol tax?
Thanks, Mr. President. Yeah, I guess I'd just say that I thought they were really productive. We got really great questions, good presentation. I think that there's a lot of alignment on how we might be able to move forward. And I just want to echo the comments from Ms. Alatel.
Super. All right. Ms. LaFrance, if you are on, would you like to share any reflections or comments related to the town hall on the alcohol tax that would be helpful for us? All right, moving on. Mr. Dunbar, are you on? And would you like to share any thoughts for the committee?
Sure. I think I mostly just want to echo what Ms. Zolotel said. I was actually sort of surprised by the number of comments that we got and the feedback we got and how it was articulated with regard to both the police and the fire department and the skepticism about increasing those budgets, particularly with the core team. I think we got one very pointed question on that. But I think that what I heard in those discussions, insofar as it touched on this topic, was a desire to see this revenue be used for alternative means to provide public safety that might save money and take pressure off of the APD and the AFD. And I realize that I'm a little biased on that because I'm one of the 3 sponsors of the mental health first responders. But I was, I should say, I guess, pleasantly surprised that that message had already seemed to be coming from the public, and it seemed to dovetail with the work that we were already planning. So it wasn't the only thing I heard, but I think it was the thing that I took away most strongly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Weddleton, are you on, and would you like to share any reflections or thoughts from the town hall meeting related to the alcohol tax that would help the committee?
I don't know if it'll help because I think you already heard it. You know, I didn't review my notes before this meeting, but I think the general flow was, you know, using that money for new things we have failed to do before. And a lot of that is that fundamental mental health and, you know, addiction recovery and so on that, you know, is kind of the root causes of a lot of the crime and so on that we have. So that, I think, like Meg said, that is public safety doing that. And I want to, you know, I've spoken against the cost of the core team before, but I want to rule out having firefighters involved, you know, with something similar. We need to find a cheaper way to do it. You know, I think they're, you know, the goals and the results were certainly good. But yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Yep, sure. Ms. Allard, are you on, and would you like to share any reflections from the town hall meetings related to alcohol tax that would help the committee?
Mr. Chair, I believe Ms. Allard's in the same meeting with Chair Rivera right now.
Great. Last one I have on my list is, there's Mr. Constant. Mr. Constant, would you like to share any reflections or thoughts that would help the committee related to the alcohol tax?
You know, it's a very thoughtful process to go through. And from the public safety perspective, I do still support the core team investments. And I was grateful to hear all of the amazing public input. And I look forward to continuing down the road of that conversation. So probably nothing too substantive other than definitely been thorough. And I kind of identify with Mr. Weddleton's point. I don't know if he made it just now. I was only half paying attention. Sorry, John. But of being careful not to spend money that we don't have, and possibly contemplating a way to make sure we raise the revenue before we spend the revenue because of the uncertainty in our economy right now.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Peterson, is there any comments you'd like to share? Any thoughts or reflections from the town hall meeting that would help us in thinking about recommendations for the alcohol tax?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just think it was great that we had a good amount of testimony from people who were calling in with their opinions and how we should use some of this alcohol tax money. It appears to me that we have many more ideas on where to spend the money than money that will be available. So we will have to make some tough decisions and tough choices on where we decide the highest priority for using this money will be. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Kennedy, is there any thoughts or reflections you'd like to share as well?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, a couple of things. And I would agree with Mr. Peterson that, it's going to be tough to figure out where the priority for the funding goes. But I was actually kind of disappointed that we didn't have more people calling in or participating in those 2 town halls. And I know it's kind of difficult when it's a call-in thing and trying to do things over the internet like this, but I'm hoping that as we start to really formulate a plan here, that we will get more feedback. So, I certainly appreciate the ones who did attend, and there have been some that have been really committed to this process, so that's been good. But I think there's probably going to be a lot more opportunity for other public participation on this. But, a couple of thoughts, though. I certainly appreciate what Ms. Zolotel is trying to do with providing more of building more of a mental health response team versus the core team. But I would hope that we don't kind of reinvent the wheel on this. I don't know that there's necessarily any real marriage between one department and this kind of service. So I hope that we can figure out where this kind of service actually needs to land. But I hope we don't kind of, like I said, reinvent the wheel on this one, because the core team has started a process and has a pretty structured way of addressing some of these needs. And it does probably need to be tweaked. So I'm hoping that we can figure out where the best place is to put that type of response to the community without kind of undoing all the things that have been done for those kinds of folks at this point. The other thing, I'm a little concerned about the idea of trying to add more health-related issues to the Public Safety Committee. I certainly understand how those things are intertwined, but at the same time, we have a health committee. So I certainly don't want to see us stepping on each other's toes and duplicating a lot of work and effort if we can avoid that. So, everything for the most part comes together and connects in some way, shape, or form, no matter what committee. But I just hope that we don't end up duplicating things of the same nature. So anyway, so that's my comment. And obviously we'll continue on in working out some more of our specific recommendations. It's still a bit of a work in progress. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. And I'll just share a couple of comments. I really appreciate what you said, Ms. Kennedy, because I think we all understand the interconnectedness between public safety and mental health and homelessness and so many of the issues that we talk about. But one of the things that we've heard loud and clear from people in Anchorage is they're concerned about crime, and that crime is on the top of many people's minds. And in general, we're hearing a lot of folks that are just not feeling very safe and are seeing changes in their community. And I think it's really important that we directly address that, and that the silver bullet isn't simply increasing mental health services. That's one part of it. But we really need to make sure that we're thinking about how we can make this city safer, reduce crime, and do that in a really comprehensive way. And so I agree with not these big swings, one direction and the other, but thinking really comprehensively about how we do it. And I don't think reducing the number of officers is the right strategy. But I also don't think that making sure that we're addressing the issues surrounding it, like mental health, like homelessness, those kinds of things. I think those are really important, and I think we've heard that pretty loud and clear from the public. Okay, I am looking in the chat to make sure before we go to public comment. I don't see any more comments in there, so we're going to move to.
Hello?
Yes, we're about to move into audience participation. And so for those of you that are on the phone or on the meetings, this is your opportunity to speak. We've got about a little bit more than 10 minutes left. So we'll try to get through as many as we can. And just remember, you have 3 minutes. I have a little timer set, so you'll hear a little sound once your time is up. And if you can make sure that you introduce yourself and share your name, and you'll have 3 minutes. Who would like to begin?
Danielle Kemp, if that's okay.
Yep, go ahead. I'm sorry, say your name one more time and go ahead and start.
Yes, Danielle Kemp.
Okay, go ahead. You have 3 minutes. Yep.
All right. Thank you to the committee for this opportunity to speak on these issues. My name is Danielle Kemp. I'm a retired Army combat officer and Eagle River resident. As we know, police violence is a big problem in the United States and Alaska and here in Anchorage. Any policy or procedure can be unnecessarily harmful or deadly to people of color if enough creative license is taken by the interpreting police officer. All right, think about it. There are visible patterns of disproportionate impact of violence and deadly policing towards Black and brown people across the United States, which includes indigenous peoples here in Alaska. Any policy that we improve or create must be geared toward the safety of the people, right? To quote unquote protect and serve. Earlier, Jeremy made a point that police officers live and work in a gray area, that they need a certain amount of discretion in order to perform their duties. This helps to bring up my next point here, that I believe that all updated policies and procedures needs to be enhanced and reinforced with a requirement that all police officers must have professional liability insurance coverage in order to hold a job. The requirement of insurance will ensure that each police officer is held personally responsible for any misconduct and not the municipality of Anchorage. Premiums for this insurance range from $200 to $400 per year, averaging. Right? Who pays the premiums? We can work that out later. Right? But currently, the muni is vulnerable to a liability suit. From the information that is publicly available, Anchorage has shelled out roughly $20 million in the last 10 years for police misconduct. All right, this is not that much in the larger scheme of things. However, this city is only one incident of police misconduct, brutality, or wrongful death away from having to pay over $200 million to $500 million in a lawsuit. And guess where that money is going to come from? Probably not the police department. All right, those funds will come from stuff like infrastructure, public works, parks and rec, health, and you guessed it, education. All right, so insurance, other cities across the United States are implementing insurance requirements for their police officers as a preventative measure, and Anchorage should be one of those. All right, insurance ensures personal responsibility and reduces the liability on the people of the municipality of Anchorage. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for your comments. Would like to speak next?
Hello?
Yes, go ahead and share your name, and you'll have 3 minutes. Go ahead and start.
Wait a minute.
Okay.
My name is Eugene Carl Haberman. I represent myself. I follow the public process. When the public process is an appropriate decision made by the governing body is more like a public interest. I live in the Matsu Valley. Okay, number one, when we talk about transparency, holding meetings such as this one, the parties, almost every party speaking with the Anchorage Police Department didn't identify who they were, name and who they were. Police chief did, but how can you have a meeting like that? This is a pattern. You need to identify who's speaking and who they are. Particularly, you're dealing with policy procedures and the statement by the police department. Now, also, these presentations done by the police department and where they represent, where they stand on, one would hope that had been in writing. Maybe you have copies of that, but it's not on any website for your committee, except for the agenda and another item, I guess coming from the union. So one would have hoped that their concerns, whatever, would have been put in writing and addressed to you in a report, and not this verbal scenario where few people can say, okay, what did they really say? Okay. Second is, you need to have a quorum. I couldn't help but notice Now, this is the Assembly Public Safety Committee, a committee of the whole, which means the entire Assembly, not just the Public Safety Committee. So many people were not present. That was obvious toward the end. There's a need to follow a quorum, and if you have a quorum, and when people are popping in and out, you may not have had a quorum for this meeting toward the end. So that's very important too, because you move to the direction of keeping people in the dark of who's there and not. You do a roll call in the beginning, but we're lost, you and all are lost of who's really there. Are you meeting the numbers requirements of quorum? And I remind you, it's not just a public safety committee, it's the Assembly Public Safety Committee of the whole, which means the entire Assembly, and that's the number, not that narrow number. And I'll leave you with that with 50 seconds to spare. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haberman. Would anybody else like to speak?
Yeah. Yes.
Yep. Go ahead and share your name,
My name-
please, and go ahead and start. You have 3 minutes.
Yes, sir. My name is Charles Hawk, or AKA Charles Dufresne. I'm just kind of getting in here on the meeting, and when I just speaking on what the other individual before the gentleman that was just speaking had said on the personal liability of the police officers. On that alone is to me one of the best starts of an idea of stuff, or even going in the right direction to having people to having the police as a whole accept responsibility. If you think about it, each of us have our own vehicles that we drive have to have insurance. We're going to drive a little safer most of the time versus driving a company vehicle. You might think like, I don't want to ruin it and lose my job, but it's not going to fall on you personally if anyone tries to sue you or anything like that. But if you're walking around with a badge and a gun and you're supposed to protect and serve, and you have in the back of your mind that if you mess up, you personally have to pay for it. I think there's going to be a lot more light stepping going on as far as how people are treated, the paperwork that's processed, the people that take a deeper look into the paperwork to actually make sure that everything's being filed correctly and things are just in order. I think so many, excuse my French, but BS type of things are thrown their way that they have piles and piles and piles of cases in different situations and things they have to take care of, but they got the real ones over here that are all in the middle of them. Nobody has time to sit there and go through all of that while people are still complaining along with COVID. You start making people take personal responsibility for things, and I think there's going to be more of a, like I said, light stepping going on, especially for on the police part. We might not deal with the whole quote unquote police brutality like we hear about in the media in the lower 48, but there's one thing that I do know for a fact up here about DOC and the police is it's over. A lot of stuff is overlooked. A lot of stuff is just thrown under the rug or just said, it's too much to look at. But again, personal responsibility with that insurance idea really makes you take a second thought before you either pull your gun or just arrest somebody because you think you got the right person. You're going to do things right. Take a second look. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your testimony. We have time for one more speaker. Who would like to share the final comments for our meeting? Going once, going twice.
I got a question for you. Nobody's going to say nothing. I'll ask you a
No,
question.
we're only allowed to have everybody speak once. So,
Go for it. This is my first time on this, so continue.
All right, sir, were you the person that just spoke?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay, great. Thanks. We'll appreciate your comments. Well, it looks like that we've done our public participation for today. I really want to thank everybody for being here, thank our speakers, and we'll make sure to, as I said, post that running list of all of the items that we've heard on our site. So look for that next week. And with that, this meeting is adjourned. Have a great day. Bye-bye.